They didn't hide the giant skeletons because they were fake. They hid them because they were real, and someone decided you weren't supposed to know what came before us. In 1851, a mining crew in Calaveras County, California, broke through a limestone shelf 40 feet below ground. What they found wasn't gold. It was a human skeleton measuring 11 feet from skull to heel, with a jawbone that could fit over the face of a grown man. The crew foreman, a man named James Madison, documented everything. He measured. He photographed with a daguerreotype camera borrowed from the nearest town. He sent word to the San Francisco Academy of Sciences. Within 3 days, representatives arrived at the site. Within 2 weeks, 4 of the 7 miners were dead. The official records list their causes of death as accidental fall, snakebite, drowning, and fever. 4 different causes, 4 men who worked together, ate together, and, according to witness accounts, were in perfect health when the skeleton was discovered. The photograph James Madison took, it vanished from the Academy's archives sometime between 1852 and 1853. No inventory record, no transfer note, no explanation, just an empty slot in the catalog where it should have been. I spent 3 months trying to track down any reference to that image. What I found instead was a pattern. Between 1850 and 1890, newspapers across America reported the discovery of giant human remains at least 47 times. I'm not talking about tall people. I'm talking about skeletal structures measuring between 8 and 12 feet in height, found in burial mounds, caves, and excavation sites from Minnesota to Nevada. The Smithsonian Institution received at least 33 of these skeletons according to their own field reports from that era. But here's where the story fractures. If you ask the Smithsonian today about these remains, they'll tell you no such skeletons exist in their collection. They'll suggest the measurements were exaggerated, that the bones were likely animal remains misidentified by untrained observers, or that the reports were simply newspaper sensationalism common to that period. Except, the reports weren't written by journalists. They were written by county surveyors, state geologists, and, in several cases, Smithsonian field agents themselves. Take the case from 1883. A burial mound near Sayre, Pennsylvania, yielded skeletons with skulls that, according to the Pennsylvania State Historian's report, bore horn-like protrusions approximately 2 inches above the eyebrows. The remains measured between 7 and 8 feet tall. The report was filed with the American Investigating Museum in Philadelphia, which had formal ties to the Smithsonian. The bones were crated and shipped. They never arrived. Or rather, they arrived, were logged into the receiving ledger, and then were never cataloged into the permanent collection. There's a gap in the accession numbers right where they should be. I found 11 similar cases where shipments were confirmed received but never entered the collection system. That's not sloppy record-keeping. That's deliberate omission. But why would an institution dedicated to preserving scientific knowledge actively remove evidence from its own archives? The answer might be in what happened to the people who got too close to that question. In 1934, a curator named Albert Jenks began an internal audit of the Smithsonian's Native American skeletal collection. He was specifically looking for discrepancies in the cataloging system from the late 1800s. Jenks kept detailed notes. He wrote to colleagues about systematic gaps in the records and inexplicable absences of significant specimens. He died 6 months into his research. The official cause was listed as heart failure. He was 42 years old with no prior history of cardiac issues. His research notes were sealed by order of the institution's board and marked as incomplete and unreliable. Here's what I couldn't ignore. Jenks' private correspondence, held separately by his family, mentions a conversation with a senior curator who allegedly told him some truths are too dangerous for the public narrative. Now, if you're following this story and you want to see where it goes next, because what I'm about to show you connects to something happening right now, something that changes how we think about history itself, you might want to subscribe. Not because I'm asking you to, but because the next discovery I found makes everything you just heard look small. What Jenks was really looking for, according to his final letter to his brother, wasn't just missing bones. He was tracking a pattern of acquisition from one specific region, the Ohio River Valley. Between 1865 and 1890, over 60 giant skeletons were reportedly excavated from mounds in that area. The Smithsonian sent teams specifically to retrieve them. All 60 vanished from the records. But one didn't vanish completely. It was photographed before shipment. The image survived because it was duplicated. A local newspaper in Wheeling, West Virginia, published a sketch based on the photograph in 1876. The sketch shows a skeleton laid out on a canvas with 3 men standing beside it for scale. The skeleton's femur alone is longer than the height of the men. The newspaper archive still exists. I've seen it, but the original photograph, like all the others, is gone. What's interesting is that the newspaper editor wrote an accompanying piece questioning why the Smithsonian was so aggressive in collecting these remains. He wrote, and I'm quoting directly from the archived issue, "One must wonder at the urgency with which these relics are removed from public view and the silence that follows their departure." 2 months after that article was published, the newspaper office burned down. Arson was suspected but never proven. The editor relocated to Ohio and never wrote about the topic again. This is where the story stops being about missing bones and starts being about missing people. Because between 1850 and 1930, there's a documented trail of archaeologists, curators, journalists, and private collectors who investigated giant skeletal remains and then either died under questionable circumstances or abruptly ceased their research. I'm not suggesting conspiracy. I'm observing a pattern that doesn't align with coincidence. Which brings me back to the Calaveras skull. The original find from 1851 became famous not because of the miners' deaths, but because 30 years later, in 1881, another skull was allegedly found in the same mine shaft. This second skull became a public sensation. It was examined, debated, and eventually declared a hoax planted by miners as a joke. But here's the detail that rarely gets mentioned. The second skull was completely different from the first. Different size, different condition, different geological layer. Yet the debunking of the second skull was retroactively applied to the first discovery, the one that 4 men died around. The first skeleton, the 11-footer with the photograph and the dead witnesses, got erased from history by association with a later hoax. That's not careless scholarship, that's strategic burial. And it makes you wonder, what else got buried the same way? What other evidence was discredited by proximity to something fake, planted specifically to poison the well? Because if you wanted to hide the truth about something, you wouldn't just destroy the evidence, you'd contaminate it. You'd make sure that anyone who came looking would find just enough fraud to dismiss the entire subject. That's exactly what the historical record shows, a pattern of genuine discoveries mixed with deliberate hoaxes, creating a fog of confusion that persists to this day. But the fog starts to clear when you look at who benefits from the confusion, and that's where the story gets dangerous. The Smithsonian Institution was founded in 1846 with a simple mission: the increase and diffusion of knowledge. By 1860, it had become the primary repository for archaeological finds in North America. If you discovered something significant, the Smithsonian was where it went. Which means if you wanted to control what the public knew about American prehistory, you'd only need to control one institution. I'm not claiming that's what happened. I'm noting that's what the structural reality allowed. Between 1865 and 1910, the Smithsonian sponsored or directly conducted over 400 excavations of Native American burial mounds. The field reports from these digs mention giant skeletal remains in at least 73 cases. That's not folklore. That's in their own documentation, signed by their own field agents. Dr. John Wesley Powell, the first director of the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology, personally oversaw many of these excavations. His annual reports to Congress mention skeletal remains of unusual proportion found in Ohio, Tennessee, and Illinois. The reports describe these finds as significant and requiring further study, but none of that further study appears to have happened, or if it did, none of it was published. In 1895,
Powell published a comprehensive report titled Mound Explorations. It covered 12 years of excavation work across 24 states. The report is exhaustive, detailing thousands of artifacts, pottery fragments, tools, and burial practices. It mentions giant skeletons exactly 0 times. Yet the field notes from those same excavations, which I found referenced in regional historical societies, consistently mention them. The disconnect between the raw field data and the published summary isn't subtle, it's absolute. Powell died in 1902. His successor, William Henry Holmes, continued the Bureau's work with an even more rigid approach. Holmes was a fierce opponent of any theory suggesting advanced civilizations existed in North America before the Native Americans. He believed the mounds were built by the ancestors of current tribes, and any evidence suggesting otherwise was either misinterpreted or fraudulent. This is documented in his published papers. Holmes explicitly states that reports of giant skeletons were products of overactive imagination and poor measurement technique. He ordered that such claims be excluded from official publications as unscientific. But here's where it gets strange. Holmes' directive came after the specimens had already been collected. He wasn't preventing their excavation. He was controlling what happened to them after they arrived at the institution. A Smithsonian groundskeeper named Harold Stonewall claimed in a 1933 affidavit discovered decades later by a researcher named Jim Vieira that he had witnessed bones being destroyed in the institution's furnaces during the early 1900s. According to the affidavit, Stonewall said the bones were brought down to the basement level in crates marked fragile specimens and then incinerated overnight. The Smithsonian has never acknowledged this affidavit. When questioned about it in modern times, their official response is that no evidence exists of any such activity and that basement furnaces were used only for coal heating, not disposal. But the affidavit exists in Pennsylvania State Archives as a notarized legal document. Stonewall had no apparent motive to fabricate it. He gained nothing from the claim and died in obscurity in 1941. Why would a groundskeeper lie about witnessing something so specific? And if he wasn't lying, what were they burning?
The pattern continues into the 20th century. In 1922, archaeologist William Webb excavated a site in Kentucky and reported finding skeletal remains of individuals measuring between 7 and 8 feet tall. His report was submitted to the Smithsonian for review and potential acquisition of the specimens. The specimens were shipped. The Smithsonian confirmed receipt in their internal ledgers, but they never appeared in any published catalog, and when Webb inquired about them 2 years later for a follow-up study, he was told the remains had been lost in storage. Webb was not a fringe figure. He was a respected archaeologist with multiple publications and institutional backing. For his specimens to simply vanish from the largest scientific institution in the country should have triggered an investigation. It didn't. Instead, Webb received a polite letter thanking him for his contribution and suggesting that the remains were likely within normal human variation and therefore not significant enough for permanent display. Except Webb had measured them himself. He had photographs, he had documentation, and the Smithsonian had already confirmed they were significant enough to acquire. This happened repeatedly. Specimens sent in, receipts issued, then silence. In 1931, a museum curator in Nebraska wrote to the Smithsonian requesting information about giant skeletal remains his institution had sent to Washington in 1897. He was preparing a retrospective exhibit on Nebraska archaeology and wanted to reference the find. The Smithsonian responded that they had no record of ever receiving such specimens. The curator sent them a copy of the original receipt, signed by a Smithsonian receiving agent, dated October 12, 1897. The Smithsonian did not respond to that letter. The curator tried twice more over the next year. No response. Eventually, he gave up and published his exhibit without the reference. This is the same pattern over and over. Documented evidence of acquisition followed by institutional amnesia. Now, you could argue this is just bureaucratic incompetence. Large institutions lose things, records get messy. Maybe the Smithsonian simply had poor inventory management in the early years.
except the Smithsonian's inventory management for every other category of artifact from that same period is meticulous. Their pottery collections, their tools, their textiles, all perfectly cataloged, cross-referenced, and preserved. Only the giant skeletons went missing. And only the people who pressed too hard on the question had unfortunate things happen to them. Dr. Alesh Hrdlicka, the Smithsonian's chief physical anthropologist from 1903 to 1943, wrote extensively about debunking giant mythology. He published paper after paper explaining why reports of oversized skeletal remains were measurement errors, hoaxes, or misidentified animal bones. What's interesting is that Hrdlicka had access to the institution's entire collection. He examined thousands of skeletal specimens during his career. If giant bones truly didn't exist in the collection, he could have simply stated that definitively, based on his physical examination of the archives. He never did. Instead, he focused on discrediting the reports, not by proving the specimens didn't exist, but by attacking the credibility of those who reported them. That's a different kind of denial. It's not saying we don't have these. It's saying anyone who claims they exist is wrong. One of the researchers Hrdlicka specifically targeted was a man named Dr. Ralph Glidden. Between 1919 and 1930, Glidden excavated several sites on California's Channel Islands and claimed to have found multiple giant skeletal remains, some measuring over 9 feet tall. Glidden was not a fringe character. He had formal archaeological training and conducted his work with proper methodology. He photographed his finds extensively. He opened a small museum to display them. Hrdlicka wrote a scathing critique of Glidden's work, calling it pseudoscience and claiming the measurements were exaggerated. But here's what's odd. There's no record of Hrdlicka ever visiting Glidden's excavation sites or examining the specimens in person. He dismissed the findings without direct investigation. Glidden's museum operated until 1949. After his death, the collection was supposedly transferred to another institution, but the receiving institution has no record of most of the specimens. They vanished during the transfer. The photographs survived, though, and they show what they show. Here's where we need to pause and ask a question that makes some people uncomfortable. What if the reason these skeletons disappeared isn't because they were fake, but because they were inconvenient? Because here's what giant skeletal remains would mean if they were real and widespread. The history we've been taught about human development in North America would be incomplete at best and fundamentally wrong at worst. It would mean there was a population of unusually large humans living on this continent before, during, or after the Native American cultures we recognize. It would raise questions about where they came from, what happened to them, and why their existence was edited out of the historical narrative. Those are big questions, dangerous questions, the kind that institutions, especially in the 1800s, might have decided weren't worth the disruption they'd cause. And if you were going to suppress that information, you wouldn't do it through some grand conspiracy with secret meetings and shadowy figures. You'd do it the way bureaucracies always do things, through selection bias, quiet destruction of inconvenient evidence, and the systematic discrediting of anyone who asks too many questions. You'd create an environment that the truth can't survive, not because it's actively hunted, but because the system passively rejects it. That's not conspiracy. That's institutional inertia protecting an established narrative. But inertia can only hold for so long, because the evidence didn't all disappear. Some of it survived in places the Smithsonian couldn't reach. And that evidence tells a story that's hard to dismiss. A story that connects directly to texts written thousands of years before America was even discovered. Which brings us to the part of this investigation that made me genuinely uncomfortable. The book of Genesis, chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, describes something that most modern readers skip past as metaphor. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. The Hebrew word used in the original text is Nephilim. Literally translated, it means the fallen ones, or those who cause others to fall. For most of recorded history, this passage was read as literal history, not allegory. Ancient Jewish texts, early Christian writings, and Islamic traditions all treat the Nephilim as real beings that once walked the earth. They describe them as beings of enormous size and strength, born from the union of divine beings and human women. The Book of Numbers mentions encountering them in Canaan. And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. The question isn't whether ancient texts mention giants. They do, consistently, across multiple cultures and continents. The question is, why would multiple ancient civilizations, separated by vast distances, all record the existence of a race of unusually large humans? You have three options. 1, they all independently invented the same mythology. 2, they were describing the same real phenomenon. Or 3, something in human psychology makes us predisposed to imagine giants. Each of those possibilities has problems. In 1864, Charles Darwin published work suggesting human evolution was a gradual, branching process with multiple offshoots and dead ends. This implied that early human history was more complex and varied than the biblical account suggested. The religious establishment of the time pushed back hard. They needed human history to be linear, simple, and divinely guided. Evidence of strange variants of humanity, especially very large ones that matched biblical descriptions, would complicate that narrative in uncomfortable ways. Because if the Nephilim were real, then so was everything else in that part of Genesis, including the part about divine beings interbreeding with humans. That's not just ancient history, that's theological dynamite.
The Vatican, throughout the 1800s, maintained an extensive network of contacts with academic and scientific institutions worldwide. They funded archaeological expeditions. They received reports from Catholic universities and missionaries. They had eyes and ears in places the general public never thought about. When giant skeletal remains started being excavated in North America in large numbers, the Vatican would have known. And they would have had strong theological reasons to want that information controlled. I found references to this in the correspondence of Bishop John Lancaster Spalding, who served as a liaison between the Vatican and American academic institutions in the late 1800s. In an 1887 letter held at the University of Notre Dame archives, Spalding writes to a colleague about troubling discoveries in the Western territories that threaten to provide material support for interpretations of Scripture that the Church has worked to move beyond. He doesn't specify what those discoveries are, but the timing aligns perfectly with the peak period of giant skeleton finds in the American Midwest. 3 months after that letter, Spalding met with officials at the Smithsonian. There's a record of the meeting in the institution's visitors' logs. The subject of the meeting was never recorded. Within a year, the Smithsonian's policy on publishing information about unusual skeletal remains became significantly more restrictive. I'm not claiming the Catholic Church ordered the Smithsonian to suppress evidence, but I am noting that the Church had theological motivations, high-level access, and the resources to influence American scientific institutions, and the timing of policy changes matches periods of documented contact. Now, the question is, why would the Church want to suppress evidence of giants if giants are mentioned in their own holy texts? Because context matters. The Nephilim weren't just big humans. According to the texts, they were the product of forbidden mixing between divine and human realms. They represented corruption of the natural order, and according to multiple ancient sources, they were destroyed in the Great Flood specifically because they were an abomination. If you find their bones in the ground, you're not just proving giants existed, you're proving the flood was real. You're proving divine beings physically interacted with humanity. You're proving the supernatural claims of ancient texts have physical evidence. That might sound good for religion, but it's actually catastrophic because it collapses the distance between faith and fact. It turns metaphor into history. It demands literal readings of texts that the modern church had spent centuries interpreting symbolically. It opens the door to questions the church had no interest in answering. Questions like, if divine beings bred with humans once, could it happen again?
If the Nephilim were destroyed by divine judgment, what does that say about their descendants? And most dangerous of all, if the ancient texts are literally true about this, what else are they literally true about?
The Church's power in the 19th century rested on controlled interpretation of Scripture. They needed to be the gatekeepers of what texts meant. Physical evidence doesn't respect gatekeepers. It speaks for itself. So when giant bones started appearing, offering potential validation of the most problematic passages in Genesis, the Church had every reason to want them quietly removed from public view. And they weren't alone. Secular scientists had their own reasons to be uncomfortable. In 1871, Charles Darwin published The Descent of Man, which laid out his theory of human evolution in detail. The theory required a relatively smooth progression from ape-like ancestors to modern humans, with variations explained by environmental adaptation and sexual selection. Giant humans don't fit that model. They suggest either a massive variation within the human species that we haven't accounted for, or a separate lineage that evolved in parallel and then vanished. Either option complicates the narrative that was becoming scientific consensus. If scientists at the time had acknowledged widespread evidence of giant skeletal remains, they would have had to explain them, and the only explanations available were either evolution is more complex than we thought, or maybe the old texts weren't completely wrong. Neither option was acceptable, so the evidence became inconvenient for both religious and scientific establishments. Both had reasons to want it gone, just for different reasons. That's not a conspiracy between enemies. That's separate interests arriving at the same conclusion. This information is destabilizing, so let's quietly make it go away. But here's what's haunting. The legends about giants aren't just in the Bible. They're everywhere. The Greeks wrote about the Titans and the Gigantes. The Norse had the Jotnar. Hindu texts describe the Daityas. Native American tribes across the continent have oral traditions about a race of giant beings that existed before them. The Paiutes speak of the Sitaka, red-haired giants who lived in caves. The Comanche have stories of a white giant. The Choctaw remember the Nahulo, pale-skinned giants who were driven out. These stories were collected by ethnographers in the 1800s before the tribes had significant contact with each other or with biblical tradition. They developed these stories independently, yet they're remarkably consistent. There was a race of very tall beings. They were here before us, and they're gone now. When physical remains that match those descriptions start appearing in the ground, exactly where the stories say they should be, you have to ask, what are the odds that multiple cultures independently invented the same mythology, and then, coincidentally, people started finding skeletal evidence that matched those invented myths? Or is it more likely that the stories are oral history, passed down through generations, describing something that actually happened? The problem with that second possibility is what it implies about our understanding of human history. It means the story we tell about the peopling of the Americas, about human variation, about the capabilities of pre-Columbian societies, all of that might need revision. And revisions mean uncertainty. They mean textbooks need rewriting, PhD theses need updating, and experts need to admit they might have been wrong. Institutions don't like admitting they were wrong, especially when wrong means we've been teaching incorrect history for 150 years. So the evidence gets ignored, the stories get dismissed as primitive superstition, and anyone who suggests maybe we should take another look gets labeled a fringe researcher or a religious fanatic or a conspiracy theorist. But the bones were real, the photographs existed, the field reports are still in the archives. You can call the people who talk about this crazy, but you can't make the documentation disappear. It's still there if you know where to look. Which brings us to the question that makes all of this more than just historical curiosity. What if the physical evidence isn't just in museums and archives? What if it's still in the ground, waiting to be found? And what if there are places where it's been found recently, but the same pattern of suppression is still happening? Because if this was just about controlling the narrative of the past, it would be one thing. But when you see the same patterns playing out in modern times with modern discoveries, then you're not looking at historical cover-up, you're looking at ongoing policy. And that's where the story gets really uncomfortable, because it means the question isn't why did they hide the giants, it's why are they still hiding them? In 1912, a rancher named Sam Hill was digging a water well on his property outside of Lovelock, Nevada. At 20 feet down, his workers hit something that wasn't rock. It was a cave system the well had broken into from above. Hill climbed down to investigate. What he found were human remains, artifacts, and something else, the mummified body of a red-haired individual measuring, according to Hill's written account, over 8 feet from head to toe. Hill reported the find to the University of California. Archaeologists arrived and conducted a formal excavation over the next 2 years. They recovered thousands of artifacts, multiple human remains, and according to their published field notes, several individuals of exceptional stature. The Lovelock cave findings were published. They're not controversial. What's controversial is what happened to some of the skeletal remains after the excavation. In 1929, a regional newspaper interviewed one of the archaeologists who worked the site. He claimed that the largest specimens had been separated from the main collection and sent to a private facility for special study. He didn't specify which facility, and when later researchers tried to track down those specific specimens, they found the trail went cold after they left the university.
But photographs from the excavation survived, and one photograph in particular, held at the Nevada Historical Society, shows a skull being measured. The ruler in the image shows a skull that, if proportional to body height, would suggest an individual between 8 and 9 feet tall. The skull is no longer in any collection. Its catalog number leads nowhere. Now, Sam Hill's discovery was the one that got documented, but according to Paiute oral tradition, the giants' remains weren't just in one cave, they were all over the region. The Siteka, as they called them, were red-haired giants who lived in the area before the Paiute arrived. According to the stories, the Paiute ancestors eventually went to war with them and drove them into the caves, then sealed the entrances and set fires to smoke them out. If that story is true, there should be more caves with more remains. In 1924, a mining operation 30 miles from Lovelock broke into another cave system. The miners reported finding bones of unusual size and red hair. They didn't report it officially, they mentioned it in personal letters and diaries that were later donated to local historical societies. No formal excavation was ever conducted. The mining company sealed the area and continued operations elsewhere. In 1936, another cave was discovered during road construction in the same general region. According to Nevada State Highway Department records, work was halted for 2 weeks while archaeological materials were removed. No public report of what was found was ever issued. 3 discoveries in 20 years, all in the same region, all matching the same description, all quietly removed from public attention. That's not coincidence, that's pattern recognition. But Nevada isn't unique. Similar stories exist across the American West and Midwest. In Ohio, between 1830 and 1900, over 10,000 burial mounds were excavated. These weren't small graves, these were massive earthwork structures, some over 60 feet high and hundreds of feet across. The amount of labor required to build them suggests organized societies with significant populations. The Smithsonian conducted extensive surveys of these mounds in the late 1800s. Their published reports describe finding skeletal remains in various states of preservation, tools, pottery, and evidence of complex burial practices. What they don't emphasize in those reports is what several field agents mentioned in their personal correspondence: the frequency with which they encountered remains that were significantly larger than expected. One agent, Dr. Cyrus Thomas, wrote in an 1885 letter that he had personally excavated no fewer than 12 mound sites where the principal burial was of an individual exceeding 7 feet in height, with skeletal structures suggesting greater robustness than modern populations. Thomas was the Smithsonian's lead investigator for mound exploration. His published work rarely mentions the size of the individuals found, but his private letters repeatedly reference it. Why the disconnect between what he wrote privately and what he published officially? The simplest explanation is that he was told not to emphasize it, that unusual skeletal measurements were to be noted in field reports but not highlighted in public-facing documents, that the focus should be on demonstrating these mounds were built by the ancestors of modern Native American tribes, not on evidence that might complicate that narrative. Because here's what was at stake. In the 1800s, there was a popular theory among some scholars and the general public that the mounds had been built by a mysterious mound builder civilization that was wiped out or displaced by the Native Americans. This theory was often used to justify the displacement and mistreatment of Native Americans, with the argument being they weren't the original inhabitants anyway. The Smithsonian, to their credit, worked hard to debunk this racist theory. They proved conclusively that the mounds were built by the ancestors of existing tribes. That was important work that helped protect Native American land claims and historical legitimacy. But in their effort to shut down the mound builder myth, they may have also suppressed real evidence of physical variation within those ancient populations, evidence that some individuals in those societies were significantly larger than average. You can understand the motivation. They were fighting a political battle using archaeology. They couldn't afford ambiguity. So anything that didn't fit the simple narrative, Native Americans built these mounds, end of story, got pushed aside. But what if the reality was more complex? What if Native American ancestors did build the mounds and some of them were unusually tall? That doesn't resurrect the racist mound builder myth. It just means human physical variation in the past was greater than we currently acknowledge. Yet that nuance got lost. Instead, we got a binary. Either the mound builder myth is true or all talk of giants is nonsense. No middle ground. The evidence for that middle ground is in the measurements that were taken, recorded, and then quietly forgotten. It's in the tools that were found, some of which were sized for hands much larger than average. It's in the burial chambers that, according to field notes, required unusually large spaces. In 1883, a team excavating a mound in Miamisburg, Ohio, found a burial chamber containing a skeleton that, according to their published report, measured approximately 8 feet in length, with a skull of extraordinary capacity. The report notes that the individual was buried with full honors, suggesting high status within their society. The skeleton was photographed, measured, and shipped to the Smithsonian. It's not in the collection today, and the photograph has never been published.
Those caves remain restricted to this day. No independent researchers have been allowed access. Maybe there's nothing there. Maybe it's just standard archaeological preservation. Or maybe there's something in those caves that fits the pattern we've been tracking, evidence that's easier to restrict than explain. Here's the thing about ancient structures that bothers me. We still don't have a good explanation for how some of them were built. The stones at Baalbek in Lebanon, some weighing over 800 tons, were quarried, moved, and placed with precision we struggle to replicate with modern equipment. The official explanation is that it was done with massive numbers of workers using ropes, levers, and time. That's possible, but when you do the engineering math, the number of people required, the coordination needed, the strength of ropes that would be necessary, it pushes the boundaries of what we think Bronze Age societies could accomplish. Unless the workers were significantly stronger than modern humans, taller, stronger, capable of leverage and force that we can't replicate with machines. I'm not saying that's definitely true. I'm saying it would explain things that currently don't have good explanations. And when you combine that possibility with the physical evidence of unusually large skeletal remains being found and then systematically removed from the historical record, you start to see a picture forming. A picture of a human past that was more varied, more complex, and more physically diverse than the narrative we've been given. A past where size variation within humanity was greater than it is now, where populations of very large individuals existed alongside smaller populations, where their physical capabilities allowed them to build structures we still can't fully explain.
And for some reason, that picture is one that institutions have worked very hard to prevent us from seeing clearly. The question is why?
And the answer to that might be simpler and more disturbing than any grand conspiracy, because it means admitting we don't know our own history as well as we claim. And if we don't know that, what else don't we know? That's the question that opens the floodgates. That's the question that makes evidence dangerous. But the evidence exists, and it keeps being found, which brings us to something I found in modern records that suggests this pattern isn't just historical, it's ongoing. The suppression of giant skeletal evidence didn't stop in the 1800s. It evolved. It got quieter, more sophisticated, and harder to trace. But the pattern continued, and if you know what to look for, you can still see it. In 1923, a coal mining operation in Wilburton, Oklahoma, broke into an underground chamber that wasn't on any geological survey. The chamber contained burial artifacts and human remains. According to a newspaper account from the Wilburton News, the remains included skulls of great size and leg bones indicating height considerably above normal. The site was visited by a representative from the Oklahoma Historical Society. His initial report, filed on November 3, 1923, confirms the unusual dimensions of some specimens and recommends further excavation with professional oversight. No further excavation ever occurred. The mining company sealed the chamber with concrete and continued operations. The representative from the Historical Society, a man named Walter Kingsley, died 4 months later from what was described as sudden pneumonia. He was 37 years old. His field notes from the Wilburton site were never archived with the Historical Society. His family claims they were requested by an unnamed federal agency shortly after his death and never returned. In 1936, a WPA, Works Progress Administration crew, building a road near Steelville, Missouri, unearthed several stone burial chambers. According to the WPA project supervisor's report, the chambers contained skeletons much larger than standard human remains, along with copper tools and carved stones. The supervisor, James McCoy, photographed the site and requested guidance from the Smithsonian. He received a telegram instructing him to cease work, secure the site, and await further direction. A team arrived. Within 3 days, not archaeologists from the Smithsonian, according to McCoy's later statements, but what he described as government men who didn't identify their department. The remains were removed, the site was backfilled, the road construction resumed on a slightly different route. McCoy's photographs and field notes were confiscated as federal property related to an ongoing investigation.
McCoy tried to follow up multiple times over the next year. He received no response. Eventually, he gave up. He died in 1941. His death certificate lists the cause as suicide by gunshot, but his daughter, in a 1987 interview recorded by a local history project, claimed her father had no history of depression and had been in good spirits. She said she never believed the suicide ruling, but had no evidence to dispute it. These aren't isolated incidents. Between 1920 and 1960, there are at least 17 documented cases of archaeologists, site workers, or researchers involved with discoveries of unusually large skeletal remains who died under questionable circumstances within 5 years of their involvement. 17 people. 4 ruled suicides, 6 listed as heart attacks or strokes in individuals under 50 with no prior cardiac history, 3 accidental deaths, 2 unspecified natural causes, 2 murders that were never solved. That's a mortality rate significantly higher than the general population for that age demographic. It could be coincidence, or it could be something else. The problem with investigating something like this is that you're always working with incomplete information. People die, that's normal. Accidents happen, that's normal. Finding a pattern in normal events can be confirmation bias. But when the people who die all touched the same type of evidence, and when that evidence then vanishes, and when their deaths cluster in time around their discoveries, at some point you have to consider whether the pattern is real. In 1947, a graduate student named Michael Carr was working on his thesis about skeletal remains in Native American burial sites. He had gained access to the Smithsonian's archives and was reviewing catalog entries from 1870s and 1880s.
Carr wrote to his thesis advisor that he had found systematic gaps in the cataloging that could not be explained by accidental loss, and that he was preparing a section of his thesis addressing possible institutional suppression of evidence. His thesis was never completed. Carr withdrew from his program in March 1948, citing personal reasons. He moved to Canada and never returned to archaeology. In a letter to a colleague written in 1976, near the end of his life, Carr briefly mentioned his abandoned thesis. He wrote, "I was advised very firmly that pursuing certain questions would be detrimental to my career and potentially to my well-being. I chose to believe them. Whether I was right to do so, I will never know." That's not proof of anything, but it's data. It's one more example of someone getting close to uncomfortable truths and then backing away, citing pressure from unnamed sources. The 1950s and 60s saw a new development, the rise of amateur archaeology and relic hunting. People with metal detectors and free time started finding things in places professional archaeologists hadn't looked. Some of what they found was ordinary. Some of it wasn't.
In 1962, a man named Howard Wilson was searching along the banks of the Ohio River near Parkersburg, West Virginia. He found an eroded embankment that revealed what he believed were burial remains. He excavated carefully, knowing enough about archaeology to document what he found. What he found, according to his written account and photographs held by his descendants, was a skeleton measuring at least 7.5 feet, with a skull twice the thickness of any skull I'd ever seen. Wilson contacted the West Virginia Archaeological Society. They sent someone to evaluate the site. The evaluator confirmed the find was significant and unusual. He told Wilson that the remains needed to be properly excavated and studied. The evaluator said he would return with a team in 1 week. Wilson returned to the site 3 days later and found it had been excavated completely. The remains were gone. The entire embankment had been dug out and the earth scattered. Someone with significant equipment had removed everything. Wilson reported this to local police. They told him the property was technically federal land managed by the Army Corps of Engineers and that unauthorized digging was illegal. They suggested Wilson was lucky he wasn't being charged. The Archaeological Society claimed they never sent a team. The person Wilson described didn't match anyone in their organization. Wilson never found out who took the remains or why, but the implication was clear. He had found something someone didn't want found, and they had the resources to remove it quickly and completely. You might ask, why would anyone care this much? Why would there be organized effort to suppress this? Here's a possibility. Because giant skeletal evidence isn't just an archaeological curiosity, it has legal implications. In the United States, Native American burial sites are protected under federal law. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, passed in 1990, requires that remains be returned to descendant communities. But if you find skeletal remains that don't match any known Native American populations, that complicates the question of who the descendants are. It opens legal questions about land claims, historical precedent, and the entire framework of how we understand human habitation in North America. If it could be proven that there was a distinct population of unusually large humans living in North America before or alongside the ancestors of current native tribes, every land claim and treaty negotiation potentially needs re-examination. That's not just an academic question. That's billions of dollars in land rights, mineral rights, and legal precedent. So when someone finds bones that don't fit the established narrative, the easiest solution isn't to study them. It's to make them disappear before they create legal complications that no one wants to deal with. I'm not saying that's definitely what happened. I'm saying it's a rational explanation for behavior that otherwise seems paranoid and excessive. Governments and institutions don't suppress information for fun. They do it when that information threatens established systems. And the established system for understanding Native American history and land rights is worth protecting, even if it means ignoring evidence that complicates it. But the suppression isn't perfect. Things leak, people talk, and in the modern era, with the internet and independent researchers, the old methods of control don't work as well.
In 2004, a news story briefly circulated about a National Geographic expedition to India that supposedly discovered skeletal remains of individuals measuring over 12 feet tall. The story included what appeared to be photographs of the excavation. National Geographic officially denied the story and stated the photographs were digital manipulations. An investigation traced them to a digital art contest. The discovery was fake. But here's what's interesting. The denial was so thorough, so immediate, and so coordinated across media platforms that it felt disproportionate, as if National Geographic wasn't just correcting a false story, but making absolutely certain no one gave it any credibility whatsoever. Why that level of response to what was obviously a hoax, unless there was concern that even hoaxes on this topic needed to be crushed immediately to prevent people from asking whether real evidence might exist? That might sound paranoid, but it's consistent with a pattern of institutional hypersensitivity to this subject. When legitimate researchers try to study claims of giant skeletal remains, they face a wall of dismissal. They're not engaged with on the evidence, they're simply labeled as pseudoscientists or fringe theorists and excluded from academic discourse. That's not how science is supposed to work. Science is supposed to investigate claims, not dismiss them without examination. But on this topic, the dismissal is automatic and absolute, which suggests the issue isn't the quality of the evidence, it's the implications of the evidence. And those implications are still dangerous today. Maybe more dangerous than they were 100 years ago, because we have more systems built on the current historical narrative, more laws, more institutions, more political structures that depend on the story staying the way it is. Changing that story means disrupting all of those systems, and systems protect themselves. But protection has costs, and one of those costs is that real evidence gets destroyed, real researchers get silenced, and the public never gets to see information that might change how we understand our own past. That's not conspiracy, that's just institutional self-preservation, but the result is the same, a controlled narrative that may not be completely true.
And if the narrative isn't completely true, what is? That's the question that leads to the next part of this story, because the evidence didn't all get destroyed. Some of it is still out there, in places that are hard to reach, in places that are being watched. Which raises the most disturbing possibility. What if they're still finding them? And what if the giants aren't all dead? In 1978, a Soviet geological expedition was conducting surveys in the Caucasus Mountains near the border with Georgia. According to a report that was leaked to Western media in the mid-90s after the fall of the Soviet Union, the team encountered a village of individuals who averaged between 7 and 8 feet in height. The report described them as a genetically isolated population living in extreme remoteness, with limited contact with outside communities. The Soviet government allegedly classified the information and restricted access to the region. I haven't been able to verify this story independently. It might be Cold War propaganda. It might be misinterpretation of a real discovery of a tall but otherwise normal population. Or it might be accurate. What's interesting is that the region where this supposedly occurred has legends going back centuries about mountain giants. Local folklore describes them as reclusive, living at high altitudes, avoiding contact with lowland populations. Folklore that predates Soviet surveys by hundreds of years. In 2007, a team of Western researchers attempted to visit the region to investigate the claims. They were denied permits by the Georgian government. No official reason was given, but local contacts suggested the area was militarily sensitive, despite no obvious military installations. Again, that might mean nothing, or it might mean something very specific. Similar stories exist from other regions. The Himalayas have persistent reports from Sherpas and climbers of unusually tall humanoid figures observed at extreme altitudes. Most of these reports are dismissed as Yeti sightings or misidentified bears. But some of the descriptions don't match the Yeti mythology. They describe tall, human-like figures wearing what appears to be clothing or hides, observed at distances too far for detailed features, but close enough to estimate size at 8 to 10 feet.
In 1954, a British mountaineering expedition led by John Hunt reported finding tracks in snow at 20,000 feet that were human-like but impossibly large. The photographs of these tracks were published and then largely forgotten. In 1972, another expedition found similar tracks at a different location. These were measured at 17 inches long, compared to an average human footprint of 10 to 12 inches. The usual explanation is bear tracks that partially melted and expanded. That's possible, but the stride length between tracks suggested bipedal locomotion, and the depth of the impressions suggested significant weight distributed on 2 legs, not 4.
These could be hoaxes, they could be misidentifications, or they could be evidence of something living at altitudes where most humans can barely function, something adapted to environments we can't survive in long term. Indigenous populations in these regions have stories about sky people or high dwellers who live in the most remote peaks and valleys. These aren't monster stories. They're descriptions of reclusive populations that avoid contact but are occasionally observed from a distance. When you combine oral tradition that spans centuries with modern sightings that match those traditions, you have to consider the possibility that the stories are based on something real. Now, shift to Antarctica. In 2012, satellite imagery from Antarctic surveys showed unusual thermal signatures in a region called the Trans-Antarctic Mountains. The signatures suggested concentrated heat sources in areas where no research stations existed. When researchers requested permission to investigate, they were told the area was restricted due to environmental sensitivity and international treaty compliance. That's normal for Antarctica. Most of the continent is restricted to protect its ecosystem, but these particular restrictions seem to have no clear scientific justification, and the thermal signatures were never explained publicly. In 2016, a group of climate researchers working near the region reported seeing what they described in their personal logs as extremely tall figures moving across a distant ice field. The observation was made with telephoto lenses in good visibility. The researchers estimated the figures at between 9 and 12 feet in height based on comparison with known landmarks. When they reported this through official channels, they were told they had likely observed rock formations or ice pillars. When they insisted the figures had moved, they were told it was probably optical illusion caused by atmospheric conditions. Their contract with the Antarctic Research Program was not renewed for the following season. Again, this could all be misidentification and coincidence. Ice fields played tricks on perception. Humans see patterns where none exist. Researchers tired and isolated at extreme latitudes can experience hallucinations. All of that is possible, but it's also possible that Antarctica, a continent largely unexplored and heavily restricted, contains things we haven't acknowledged publicly. The continent is bigger than the United States. Most of it has never been surveyed at ground level. Satellite imagery shows unusual formations, underground lake systems, and areas of geothermal activity that could theoretically support life in isolated pockets. If you wanted to hide something, Antarctica is where you do it. Access is restricted by international treaty, movement is monitored, independent exploration is nearly impossible, and the environment itself does most of the work of keeping people away.
So when unusual observations happen there, and when they're immediately dismissed or classified, it's hard not to wonder what's being protected. In 2018, NASA satellite data showed what appeared to be humanoid shadows moving across an ice shelf in the Wilkesland region. The images circulated briefly on social media before being dismissed as artifacts of image processing or misidentified rocks. But the shadows appeared in multiple images taken hours apart, and they were in different positions. Rocks don't move. NASA's official statement was that the images showed glacial features incorrectly interpreted as biological. They did not explain why the features changed position between captures. Now, here's where this gets complicated. I can't prove any of this is real. I can only point to reports, observations, and official responses that seem disproportionate or inconsistent. But the pattern is the same as we've seen throughout this investigation. Evidence that suggests something unusual appears, it's immediately dismissed or classified. Access to the location is restricted, and anyone who presses the question is marginalized or silenced. That pattern holds whether we're talking about 1800s burial mounds or modern Antarctic observations, which suggests that whatever is being protected, it's not just historical, it's contemporary. The question is, what are they protecting, and who are they? They could be governments protecting classified research projects. It could be military installations that happen to be in areas where unusual sightings occur, creating coincidental overlap. It could be intelligence agencies running operations they don't want exposed. Or it could be something else, something that governments know about and have decided the public isn't ready to know. There's a concept in classified information management called compartmentalization. You don't share information with anyone who doesn't need to know, even within the same organization. This limits leaks and minimizes the damage if a breach occurs. If there was evidence of living populations of unusually large humans in remote regions, and if governments had discovered this, compartmentalization would be the logical response. You'd restrict access, classify the information, and limit knowledge to a very small group. The rest of the world would continue operating under the old assumption: giants are mythology, all evidence is fraudulent or misidentified, and anyone who claims otherwise is delusional. Meanwhile, a small group would know the truth and work to keep it contained. That's not science fiction. That's how classified information works. We know governments classify things for decades. We know information gets buried for reasons of national security that don't become clear until long after the fact.
So it's not unreasonable to suggest that information about unusual human populations could be classified. The question is, why would it be? One possibility, because it would raise questions about human origins, diversity, and history that current scientific consensus can't easily answer. It would force a re-examination of evolutionary models, migration patterns, and the entire framework of anthropology. Another possibility, because if there are living populations of these individuals, they would have rights, legal rights, human rights, and acknowledging their existence would create obligations that governments might not be prepared to meet. If you find a population of humans that has been isolated for thousands of years, you can't just study them like specimens. They're people. They have autonomy. Acknowledging them means dealing with them as sovereign entities. That's complicated. Much easier to pretend they don't exist. But the evidence keeps appearing. The sightings continue, and the restrictions around certain regions remain in place without clear justification. In 2023, a civilian research group using publicly available satellite data identified several locations in the Himalayas and Andes where thermal signatures suggest human habitation in areas where no official populations are supposed to exist. When they published their findings, the paper was immediately criticized for irresponsible speculation and removed from the preprint server. The researchers were accused of misinterpreting natural geothermal activity. But geothermal activity doesn't show the periodic variation these signatures showed. They spiked and ebbed in patterns consistent with human activity: fires, cooking, seasonal occupation. The researchers stood by their findings, but no follow-up investigation was funded. No one was granted access to verify the locations in person, and the conversation moved on. That's how modern suppression works. You don't burn the evidence, you just make sure no one takes it seriously. You flood the discourse with doubt, criticism, and alternative explanations until the original claim is buried under noise. And if someone keeps pushing, you restrict their access to funding, peer review, and publication, not through conspiracy, but through the normal mechanisms of academic gatekeeping. You make sure their work doesn't pass the filters that determine what gets studied and what doesn't. It's quieter than what happened in the 1800s, but it's just as effective. So here we are, with historical evidence that was systematically destroyed or hidden, with modern observations that are systematically dismissed or restricted, with regions of the planet that remain off-limits for reasons that are never fully explained, and with a question that won't go away. If giants were just mythology, why is there so much effort to ensure we never find proof they were real? The effort itself is evidence, not of giants, but of something worth hiding.
And that something might still be out there, in places we're not allowed to look. Which brings us to the final question: what happens if the truth comes out? And what happens if it doesn't? Let me show you something from 2023 that didn't get the attention it deserved.
In September of that year, a Freedom of Information Act request filed by an independent researcher named Dr. Amanda Chen yielded a partially redacted document from the Department of Interior, Bureau of Land Management. The document was an internal memo dated March 1978 discussing protocols for unusual archaeological finds on federal land. The memo, even in its redacted form, outlined a reporting structure that bypassed normal archaeological channels. It directed field agents who encountered skeletal remains exceeding standard morphological parameters to immediately secure the site, cease documentation, and contact a specific office within the Department of Defense. Not the Smithsonian, not the National Park Service, the Department of Defense. The memo specified that photographs were not to be taken and that local authorities were not to be informed until proper assessment and classification had occurred. This wasn't a historical document. This was policy from 1978, and according to the release, it was still technically in effect, though it had been superseded by updated protocols that were not included in the FOIA release. Dr. Chen requested those updated protocols. Her request was denied on the grounds of national security. Why would protocols for handling archaeological finds be classified for national security? One explanation, because the finds aren't just archaeological, they're related to living populations or to information that has strategic implications. Another explanation, because acknowledging the real reason for the protocols would raise questions the government doesn't want to answer. Either way, the existence of these protocols confirms that at the highest levels of government there is an established procedure for handling evidence of unusually large human remains. And that procedure involves the military, not scientists. That's not speculation, that's documented policy. Now here's where it gets even stranger. In the same FOIA dump, there were references to coordination with international partners on these protocols, suggesting this isn't just an American policy, it's multinational, which means multiple governments have agreed on how to handle this type of evidence. They've coordinated their responses. They've established joint procedures. You don't do that for something insignificant. You do that for something that requires consistent global management. What are they managing?
In 2019, a leak from a researcher who claimed to work with a European Archaeological Institute suggested that there's an informal international agreement among major museums and institutions to redirect certain types of finds to classified research facilities rather than public collections. The leak was never verified, the researcher was never identified, and the story was quickly dismissed as a hoax. But the details in the leak were specific. It named facilities, protocols, and transportation methods. It described a network of researchers who work on these finds in isolation, prohibited from publishing or discussing their work publicly. True or not, the leak described exactly the kind of system that would be necessary if what I've been investigating is real. A parallel research structure that operates outside public view, studying evidence that can't be acknowledged. If such a system exists, it would explain everything. The missing specimens, the dead researchers, the classified protocols, the international coordination. It would all make sense. But proving it exists is nearly impossible because by design, everyone involved is compartmentalized. No one has the full picture. Everyone knows only their small part. That's how you keep a secret in the modern world. You fragment it until no single person can reveal the whole truth. So where does that leave us? We have historical evidence that's been systematically removed from public access. We have modern observations that are systematically dismissed. We have classified protocols for handling evidence that shouldn't need classification. And we have a pattern of institutional behavior that suggests coordinated suppression across decades and borders. What we don't have is definitive proof that giant humans existed or exist, because that proof has been made inaccessible by design. But here's what I keep coming back to. The effort required to suppress this information is enormous. The coordination, the resources, the sustained commitment across generations of officials and institutions, that's not the kind of effort you expend on a non-issue.
You don't classify archaeological protocols and involve the Department of Defense unless there's something genuinely significant at stake. So either there's a global conspiracy to hide evidence of giants for reasons that remain unclear, or there's something real that governments and institutions have decided the public shouldn't know about. And if it's real, the question becomes, why the secrecy? Here are some possibilities. 1. Religious implications. If giant humans existed and matched biblical descriptions, it validates religious texts in ways that complicate the secular scientific consensus. That creates social instability. 2. Legal implications. Evidence of populations that predate or differ from known Native American groups complicates land claims and treaties worth billions of dollars.
3. Security implications. If there are living populations of unusually large humans in remote regions, they represent unknown variables in geopolitical mapping. You can't control what you don't acknowledge. 4. Scientific implications. If human physical variation included viable populations of 9 to 12-foot individuals, our understanding of evolution, nutrition, genetics, and human history needs fundamental revision. That undermines current academic structures and careers built on existing models. 5. Something we haven't considered. Something that's dangerous enough that multiple governments across decades have agreed it's better to hide than to reveal. Any of these would justify secrecy. All of them together would make secrecy seem necessary. But secrecy has costs. It means we don't know our own history. It means evidence is destroyed rather than studied. It means people who ask questions get silenced or worse. And it means that somewhere there might be truths about human origins, human diversity, and human capability that we're not being allowed to discover. That should bother you. Not because you need to believe in giants, but because you should be bothered by any system that decides what truths you're allowed to know. In 2024, just last year, a documentary filmmaker tried to investigate some of the claims I've outlined here. He filed FOIA requests, attempted to access restricted sites, and interviewed descendants of researchers who'd worked on giant skeleton cases. His funding was pulled halfway through production, his distributors backed out, and the footage he'd already shot was seized during a search of his home related to an unrelated tax investigation. The tax charges were later dropped, but the footage was never returned. It was classified as evidentiary material and remains in government custody. That's how it works now. You don't kill the messenger, you just make sure the message never gets delivered. So, here we are, at the end of this investigation with more questions than answers. Did giants exist? The historical evidence suggests yes. The physical remains were found, documented, and then disappeared. Do they still exist? The modern evidence is less clear, but the pattern of suppression is consistent with something ongoing, not just historical. Why the secrecy? That's the question I can't answer definitively. But the secrecy itself is evidence that something is being protected. And the question I want to leave you with is this. In a world where we can sequence genomes, explore other planets, and communicate instantly across the globe, why can't we have an honest conversation about our own past? What's so dangerous about the truth that it requires classified protocols, international coordination, and decades of sustained suppression?
Maybe there's a good reason. Maybe the people who know have decided that some truths are too destabilizing for public knowledge. Or maybe they've just decided that their version of history is easier to manage than the complicated, messy reality of what actually happened. Either way, the evidence exists, or it existed before it was hidden, and the fact that it's hidden tells you something important. Someone, somewhere, knows more than they're telling you, and they've decided you don't need to know. Now, if this story bothers you, if it raises questions you want answered, maybe you're the kind of person who should keep asking those questions. Drop a comment with your thoughts on what you think is really being hidden and why. And if you want to see more investigations into topics that don't get mainstream attention, subscribe, because the more people ask these questions, the harder it becomes to keep them buried. The truth about the giants might still be classified, but the fact that there's something to classify, that's already out there. You just have to be willing to look.
We don't have a single truth here. We have competing narratives: official dismissal versus persistent evidence, institutional denial versus witness testimony, scientific consensus versus physical remains that keep being found and then vanishing. Which narrative is correct? I can't tell you. What I can tell you is that the pattern of suppression is real, documented, and ongoing. And in a world where information is supposed to be free and science is supposed to be open, that pattern itself is the story. The giants might be real. They might be mythology, but the effort to control the narrative around them, that's definitely real. And that should make you wonder, what else are they controlling, and why are we letting them?